Thank you for joining us here on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And first and foremost, since this is our first program of 2021, we wish you and yours all the very best for the new year, and may it be a better year than the one we've left behind. Be safe and be well. We invite you to continue sending in your questions to us here at Ask a Historian, and we'll explore the fascinating history of the city of Mississauga together. Is there anything that you're curious about? Anything you've wondered about during your travels? A street name? An old building? People from our past? Send in your questions and we will have a fascinating time exploring the story of us. On this week's episode, we have something a little different. We will be chatting with Richard Collins about his research into how Mississauga got its name. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to continuing to turn over the stones of our past with you each and every week. So joining us this week on Ask a Historian is Richard Collins from Ottawa. Richard, a longtime resident here in Mississauga and a past president of the Mississauga South Historical Society, a lifetime member of Heritage Mississauga, and a longtime interpreter at the Museums of Mississauga. Of course, Ottawa stole him away. We might successfully steal him back, but we'll figure that out as we go. Richard has done some exceptional work on the background story behind how Mississauga got its name. But first and foremost, Richard, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. I hope 2021 is going to be a great year.
Well, it certainly, well, hopefully it can be worse than 2020. So we have our fingers crossed for everybody for safe and happy, but most importantly, a healthy new year. Several years ago, and honestly, I don't have the date, but I would say it's probably 2013, 2014, somewhere in there, you did a series of articles in the Heritage News publication on how Mississauga got its name. And it ended up being one of the most read sections or read articles in our newsletter. It was quite commented on at the time, and a great rolling story. If I'm not mistaken, there were 8 parts, which means we published 3 times a year. So it was about a 2.5 year process to get the whole story out. You did some exceptional research into how Mississauga got its name. And I'm wondering, before we jump into it, is just how did you go about gathering the material for this investigation on how Mississauga got its name?
Well, I got to thank the library staff at the Central Library first and foremost, because it was through Dorothy Q at the time and Liz McQuaig got me into the township records that were all on microfiche. I hadn't used microfiche in a long time since then, but all the township records and just having to go through all of them and trying to, there's no search thing nowadays. If you got PDFs on the computer, you can search for keywords. With microfiche, you just have to keep going at it. Dorothy and Liz were a huge help in helping me go through the township records. And that's where a lot of the information had been hidden. It wasn't even known at the time because most people don't bother with council records and things like that. So it was interesting finding that, and a lot of work. And then the newspapers, Streetsville Review and the various port credit papers that were around at the time. It was fun going through those.
I said they must have had a certain look at the situation of what's going on around them, but of course, Port Credit and Streetsville were independent of the time. So
yeah, so the two news. It's interesting. The 2 newspapers in what is now Mississauga didn't really care much about it because that was the township beyond the 2 independent towns. So, but it was big news.
So maybe we'll jump ahead just because there's you made a segue there, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't totally intentional, but we can jump into the whole legend about the newspaper named the town, and the story of Kenneth Armstrong and how the Mississauga News came to be. It's not true, but it might be.
Well, yeah, it's one of those yes and no. It's I was first heard the story from Scott Gillies, who I was working with at the Bradley Museum in Benares at the time. And he had heard the story, so I'm getting the story third or fourth hand. And the story was Kenneth Armstrong, who had a newspaper that was just starting, that he was going to call the White Oaks News, because it was just going to be local Clarkson, Warren Park, the White Oaks area. And but it was around the same time that he had a property in Clarkson that bordered onto the British American oil property, Suncor now, but it was British American at the time. And he was talked by local residents into saving what is now the Bradley Museum. So a person who had no real interest in history suddenly became knee deep and wallet deep in trying to save the Bradley Museum. And so when he finally got around to naming his newspaper, he had heard about the Mississauga Nation and their history and thought, wow, Mississauga, that's a catchy name. I'm going to name my newspaper that. And so sure enough, when the township was still called the Township of Toronto, he chose, obviously didn't want to have Toronto in his name. So yeah, he chose the Mississauga News. So there was a Mississauga News newspaper before there was a town or city of Mississauga.
And it first published, forgive me if I'm wrong, but 1963, I believe, was the first publishing.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. So it was a few years, yeah. And the debate had just been started at the time. It was Hyle Chappell, who was one of the counselors at the time, who suggested, and he wasn't thinking so much about the name, he just felt that it was about time that the township take on either town or city status, easier for raising funds, for improved public transit and things like that. And so we thought, well, we have to go from being a township to a town or a city. So if we go to a city, obviously we can't keep the name Toronto Township and become the city of Toronto. And so he just bandied about names, and I guess he'd heard the name Mississauga, supposedly from Kenneth Armstrong, who was a golfing buddy. And he proposed it at an early council meeting in 1963. So this is 3 or 4 years before the city finally changed its name. But even he said in the council minutes, that's what surprised me, is that he said Mississauga or some such other name. So he wasn't really attached to Mississauga. He just suggested we had to have something other than Toronto. And that's the name he came up with.
And there was a story also about our former Reeve, Mary Fix, prepared to fight for the Toronto name.
Yeah, she loved Toronto.
What was the headline? They stole our name and we want it back. Is that the?
Yes. She was. Well, she was a lawyer. To be fair, at least she was a trained lawyer, born here in Ottawa, and had tried to make it as a lawyer here in Ottawa. But this is 1920s when she graduated from Osgood, and people just weren't hiring women at the time. So long story short, on Mary McNulty, she ended up becoming a fashion purchaser for Eaton, met her husband over there, Alphonse Fix, and they found a home in Toronto, in Toronto Township. And she, in 1955, 56, I can't remember now, she ran for Reeve, because Toronto's still a township, so no mayors yet. And so as a lawyer, she felt, we could fight for the name Toronto. Kind of a complicated story, but to get into it, to get to Mary's defense, we were Toronto when Toronto was still called York. And so she decided on the one hand that, well, if we want to change our name, we're the legal owners of the name Toronto. And one thing that made us legal owners of the name Toronto, it's interesting because I can see looking over your shoulder right now, a little bit of glare on him, but you got Sir John Beverly Robinson. There he is. He may be the reason why Mary felt that we could hold on to the name Toronto, because he was the Attorney General at the time. There were several places called Toronto because it was an Aboriginal word, possibly meaning place of meaning. We don't know. It was a catchy name. Finally, there was a fight between the post office in what is now Mississauga and a post office in what is now Port Hope. And someone had to make a decision as to which one got to keep the name Toronto. And Sir John, being from this area, he picked the Toronto that he knew, and it became official because he was the Attorney General of Upper Canada at the time. So as far as Mary was concerned, this is an official document that gave our town the first official use of the name Toronto, and then the other Torontos kind of came back 1834 and walked away with it. And we never owned title to it. So, but I think the problem with Mary is that a lot of people, Hyle Chappell and others, certainly Anthony Adamson, they wanted a new name. They felt that Toronto really wasn't theirs anymore. They wanted something new and splashy. And so they never really got on Mary's side. I think she realized she was fighting a losing battle. But Go for it.
I think that's one of the interesting things about our history is sometimes, newer residents might not realize this part of it. And it's a little thing, but it complicates our record search from a history perspective as well, is that between 1834 and 1967, there were two Torontos side by side. You had the city of Toronto and you had Toronto Township, but quite often the records are simply abbreviated to Toronto. And it can mean there or it can mean here, and that becomes part of the challenge.
I know I got frustrated, even up into when I was doing this research. I got rid of my hockey cards about 10 years ago. I used to collect hockey cards. And I'd get frustrated once I moved to Mississauga that you would see people like the Stanfield family, the Stanfield hockey players. We know they're all born in the Dixie area, but their official record probably says Toronto Township, but the hockey cards just said Toronto. And that used to peeve me. No, Stanfield were not born in Toronto. They were born in Mississauga. They just happened to be Toronto Township at the time. So yeah, that confusion. People see Toronto Township and they just assume, lock the township off. They just mean Toronto. Well, no, they don't.
And there was also I believe it was 1965, the Plunker report Plunkett, sorry, my apologies. That came up with the name of the urban municipality of Mississauga, I believe. And this is before Mississauga was really on the table to be a name.
Yeah, I can't find out where he got the name, although certainly he was talking to other councillors, because one of the big issues with the Plunkett report is he was trying to make local government smaller by having fewer, bigger cities. So a lot of councillors didn't like Plunkett because a lot of them were going to lose their jobs if the Plunkett report was approved. But he surely was talking to all these councillors in Toronto and Toronto Township and Trafalgar Township and all that. So it's possible in a chat with Heil Chappell about the future, Heil may have brought up the name Mississauga, because sure enough, it does appear in his report. And I can't find any other way he would have come up with it other than probably chatting with councillors that he knew that had brought it up.
But then, come forward to, I don't know if plebiscite is the right word, but certainly a search for a name. A committee is formed. Well,
the first step, even before a committee was formed, is opening the Pandora's box and letting the public decide. There was a committee that was added later, and one question was, why did we have a committee formed after? This is where the township records came in so useful, because in January of 1965, when they finally worked out a lot of the details about how they were going to split the money with Port Credit and Streetsville if they didn't join. You had to consider all your revenue sources, a lot of things to consider when you're incorporating as a town or a city. And the naming kind of was pushed off to the side. It was important, but it wasn't an immediate issue. And so in January of 1965, they sent out form letters to everyone that lived in the township. So that didn't include Port Credit and Streetsville, just in the township, and saying you've got till the end of the month, which is about 25 days, was right after New Year's, to send in suggestions. I guess they didn't realize how many suggestions they got. They got over 4,000 people, and I believe it was 886.
I've got 889 here.
889, okay. I know it was around 860 or something, and the deadline, which was January 31st, was a Sunday, no postal service, so they added 2 more days. And in that 2 more days, they had like another 30 or 40 new names. and so they had this huge, but there really wasn't much to settle on, because I can't remember the list right now.
I've got the list in front of me.
I have the list right now.
So number 1 was Mississauga at 5.
Yeah, number 1 was way out in front of Mississauga.
And then Cooksville?
Yeah, with maybe about a quarter
120
of the total votes. 120, and yeah, Mississauga was 513.
Number 3 was Winston at 95.
Yeah, Winston, and then Churchill was number 9, because Winston Churchill had died that same month. So
you had Winston at number 3 and Churchill at number 9. You also had Peel at number 4, Arundel at number 5, Dixie at number 6, Credit Valley at number 7, Port Credit at number 8, although Port Credit was not allowed.
Yeah, they said, because if Port Credit doesn't join, they're going to keep their name. So do not choose Port Credit or Streetsville. And yet it came in the top 10.
We didn't follow directions very well.
Well, plus a lot of people in the township were still getting their mail sorted Port Credit. So even though they were paying their taxes into the township, their postal address was Port Credit. So it was confusing. They liked the name. I like the name.
Number 9 was Churchill. Number 10 was Kennedy. Number 11, Springfield, and number 12, Sheridan at 38 votes.
Yeah, and that's going to come into play in a minute. Number 12. Yeah, so Mississauga was so far out in front. Like I said, literally, if you add all the other top 10 together, they don't total Mississauga. The public really loved it. Why, I don't know, because it is a long name, and it is a name that's easy to misspell. And to be fair, at the time, I don't think the average person who lived in Toronto Township, allow me to say this because I'm talking about the 60s, I don't think they really gave much of a damn for the Aboriginal time. We certainly do now, thanks to the work of, I'm going to do a plug for Heritage Mississauga and for the Mississaugan credit. We're much more aware of the significance of our city name, but we weren't at the time. I guess people just liked it. But the politicians...
Some of the other names here that you've got recorded, and some of them we can talk about because they make me smile, but
some of them are fun.
We have Birchwood, Britannia, Clarkson, Crediton, Creditvale, Fairfield, Glenlevin, Graydon, Huron, Ontario, Jalna, Lakeland. Not sure where that one came from.
Yeah, some of them are odd.
Lakeview, Lakewood, Lorne Park, Malton, Meadowvale, Monton.
Monton, I can't figure out. Newport,
Ootpick.
Ootpick was a little, they were very popular at the time. It's the Inuit word for snowy owl.
Yeah.
And they were little, kind of like pet rocks at the time. They were little toys that had felt beaks. And so, yeah, Ootpick was just a popular toy.
Weren't they associated with Expo 67 too, the little doll?
Probably, I guess they were marketed as a symbol of Canada at a Canadian exhibition. So, yeah, they were, but Ootpick.
We had Orchard Park, Peelsport, Riverport, Robindale, not sure that one, Sherwood, South Peel, Springburn, Summerlee, Westport, White Oaks, and Wynwood.
Yeah, and those, if there's 32 names, though, those were the ones when council finally did set up a naming committee to go through the 800 odd names, even though one of them was so far out in front, it makes you wonder why they formed the committee in the first place. And that's the 32 names they came up with. Now, keep in mind, of all those submissions, Mississauga had 513 submissions, and it's not on that list of 32. So the politicians did not want Mississauga.
What was it? The old adage under Reeve and then Mayor Bob Speck was, I don't care what they call it as long as it's short and easy to spell. That was the old line.
Yeah. He was also very business oriented. So I got to give Robert Speck, who eventually became the mayor and became the town of Mississauga's only mayor. He was looking for something that meant business, and maybe figured Mississauga, while it had some history. The two names he liked were Malton, because the airport was there. He thought, well, when people can do business, why not move close to the airport? Which is smart business sense. You got to give Robert Speck credit there. Although, how many people flying to Malton Airport really think they're landing in Toronto Township when they're actually going to what anyone thinks of as Toronto's airport? So, and the other one that he really liked was Sheridan, because the Sheridan Research Center was being built at the time. That was high tech, that was business, big taxpayers, which is what Speck was looking for. And so he really favored Sheridan. He liked Sheridan a lot. And even though it was only number 12 in the voting, he supported that one all through the council records for about 2 years.
Well, you also had at the same time, put things in context as well. Sheridan Research Park, yes, put it on the map. A lot of the employees lived in Sheridan Homelands, which was the largest subdivision being built in Mississauga at that time. And in 1965, Sheridan Mall opened up.
That's true, yeah.
And so, Sheridan was a name that was in circulation more than we think about it today.
That's true, yeah.
And of course, Malton, for obvious reason, the industrial base that was in Malton, the airport, of course, really in that era, the future of the township was tied to Malton.
And that was part of the problem.
Yeah.
Because Speck and obviously Frank McKechnie at the time, because he was the councillor for Malton, they were heavily in favor of Malton. And it seemed like it was going to be a done deal. Well, we'll go with Malton. Everyone seemed to kind of agree on that one, even more so than Sheridan. But the problem is the people of Malton didn't want to be part of Toronto Township for the very reason you meant Avro and Orenda and all sorts of other industries. Toronto Township was relying on all the industries that were mostly up in Malton. And Malton people were thinking, we should separate from Toronto Township and become our own town. Yep. And so they formed the community, formed a committee, and they made an application to the OMB. The OMB kind of struck it down and said you really should be negotiating with the township instead of fighting with them. They got upset about that. They hired a lawyer, who was John Spinka, one of Ontario's most noted lawyers. And he finally took it back to court and managed to get an appeal. And the problem with the Malton people appealing the decision to break away is that everyone had agreed on Malton and Sheridan to go on the ballot. Everything was ready to go so that Township of Toronto could become the town of Malton or Sheridan on January 1st, 1965. But 2 months before that, the judge said that the townspeople of Malton, their case for separation could be heard, but it would get delayed until sometime in 1965, which now meant the 1965 election was over for incorporation. It delayed everything 2 years. Speck was furious with the people of Malton. So now with the name that he formerly liked, he now absolutely hated, because he realized the Malton people have rebelled against the township they live in. They lost their case, obviously, because Malton is still part of Mississauga. So that's good news. We're lucky to still have Malton. But yeah, they delayed incorporation from 1965 until 1967. And that really affected how Mississauga ultimately got its name.
We have here, in 1966, the council had narrowed it down to 5, and Oneida, Malton, Mississauga, Peel, and Sheridan. Only Malton was on the original list of 32 names.
Yeah, and was on the, I'm not too sure, maybe the top 12. That was actually at the this is how crazy it got. So ignore 1965 now, it's long gone.
Yeah.
This is fighting over again to get ready for the 1967 election. The OMB has said it's ready to go. Malton's move for separation was overturned. Everything's all nice and legal, but you still have to have election ballots printed for the municipal election. You have to have the names of all your candidates on there, and you have to have the names of there has to be at least 2 choices for the people to vote on for the name of the new town. So when you're voting in your 1967 council and your first mayor, you're also going to get the chance to select between 2 names. And it really came down to, you have to have this stuff to the Queen's printer by, I think, October 21st, something like that. And this was the October 16th meeting. They had to make a decision that council meeting. Otherwise, they would have defaulted from the 2 years because they wouldn't have had the ballots ready for the election. And so they were forced to bring some names to the ballot. Sheridan was put forward because it always been there. I can't remember the number. I think it was, of the 8 councillors that were there, Robert Speck was in the hospital at this point after his first heart attack. So the 8 councillors that were there, it was overturned by 5-3. They didn't want Sheridan. Then Malton came up. It was overturned 7-1. I think Frank McKechnie voted for Malton and no one else did. Peel they didn't like, but it was unpopular. And then, Oneida, which frustrates me because I can explain the Oneida story later. It's an Aboriginal. It's one of the 5 nations of the Mohawks. So why would they overturn the name Mississauga only to favor the name Oneida, which is an indigenous nation that has nothing to do with our local history? But a land developer that was building most of the buildings of the Sheridan Research Center was the Oneida Development Corporation. So that's how that got in there. And then finally, Mississauga was put to the table at this meeting, and it was a 4-4 tie.
Hardly a resounding success.
Yeah, and so the 2 names that ended up going onto the ballot was a 4-4 tie and a 5-3 loser, Malton and Sheridan. And that's how close we came to not getting Mississauga. It only got on there because at the last minute, people realized, why don't we like the name Mississauga? The public clearly likes it. I think it was Chick Murray, who essentially was going to be mayor because Robert Speck ran unopposed, but he was in the hospital, and Chick Murray was running unopposed as deputy mayor. So he kind of knew he'd be running things. I think he realized the best thing to do was just to heal the wounds by putting Mississauga on the ballot, clearly it's popular with the people. Let's get it on there. And so, yeah, that was it. That was a 4-4 tie and a 5-3 loss. The two names that got on the 1967 ballot to vote for the 1968 council.
You also get the impression from reading your work and that understanding the timeline that they were tired of it too. They wanted the debate to be over.
Yeah. And they
so
dragged it on too long, and they kept putting it to the side. And the newspapers, for the most part, through most of 1967, seemed to ignore it. I can remember going through months and months and finding nothing about it. But then, as the election time came, you can see my cat trying to attack me. As election time came, it became a heated debate again, especially when council kept delaying on finally what two names are going to be on the ballot. The public needs to know what two names are going to be on the ballot. And that's when they opened the floodgates and people said, yeah, maybe we should just go with Mary and stick with Toronto and fight for it. All sorts of crazy names. A lot of people had a problem with Oneida again, because clearly, if you don't want to name the town after the indigenous nation that lived here, why would you pick the name of another indigenous nation? No disrespect to Oneida, but they didn't live in this area. So why pick that name? And while Sheridan was popular, as you mentioned, and people knew it because of the mall, because of the research center in the subdivisions, it probably got its name after a very popular playwright, Richard Sheridan. He's got some pretty funny stuff. I still think his comedy holds up pretty good after almost 300 years. But at the same time, he was also a member of Parliament in the UK, and he was fairly vocal about supporting the American Revolution and supporting the French Revolution, which kind of irked a lot of people in Britain at the time. And so a committee was formed in Clarkson just to stop the name Clarkson, or stop the name Sheridan, just because they didn't really like the man. They didn't think he was an appropriate name for the town. Although most people, when they were going with Sheridan, almost certainly hadn't heard of Richard Sheridan in the first place.
I said it was a 200 years after his passing. It was a smear campaign.
Yeah, it was pretty nasty. He was a debtor, and he killed someone in a duel, which wasn't true. He was in 2 duels, but dueling back in this time in the UK really didn't involve shooting someone. You tended to try and nick them and wound them or something without killing them. Because to kill them in a duel is still murder. You go to prison for it. And so, yeah, he was in 2 duels, but they didn't amount to. In fact, one duel was with the man who eventually became his father. Because of the duel over the daughter. He lost the duel, but he still won his daughter's heart. So, and then they ended up buying a theater together to show off all of his plays. So I think he's an interesting man, and Sheridan would have made a nice name, although I much prefer Mississauga. So, as did most people that day on election day, because I don't know if we're getting near the end here, but if you want, obviously we know who won, because if you're watching Heritage Mississauga, you know we're not called Heritage Sheridan. It did go to the polls that day, one of the lowest turnouts in history, surprisingly, for such an important decision, because they weren't just going to elect a new council like you do every year. This was the one to pick a new name for their new city. And I forget the numbers, but Mississauga was way over fun.
Yeah, I've got them here. The final tally was Sheridan with 4,311 votes, and Mississauga with 11,796 votes. It wasn't close.
Almost 4 times as much. And that totals 15,000 people out of, I think at the time I calculated based on the population that 56,000 people had the right to vote. They were over 18. So 56,000 people, only 15,000 voted.
Yeah.
Almost 40,000 didn't vote.
They didn't like the name choices. Maybe they didn't like the name choices.
Yeah, who knows? I got thinking about it. Maybe this frustration just jaded the public so much that by the time election day came, they didn't really care.
Well, for those of us who have lived here and spent a lot of time here and grown to love this place, and you can't think of it anything else other than Mississauga. It means this place. It's the story of this place, and its name is tied to history. And the fact that our residents chose it is something to be proud of, I think.
And it's such a unique name because there are lots of indigenous names in Toronto, Niagara. You can rhyme them off. There's so many that have Winnipeg, but as far as I can tell, Mississauga is the only city that's actually named after an Aboriginal nation rather than like an indigenous word like Toronto and Niagara. we are unique, I think, in being the only city that bears the name of a specific First Nation.
And we should touch on, again, so we were speaking of the indigenous Mississaugas as well, and the after the name was chosen, they had the next task of actually getting permission to use it. And they had a name on a ballot that people voted for, but they had not yet approached the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for use of the name, and that took place just before Christmas of 1967, where they were gained approval of the name.
That was definitely something Chick Murray did again, because he was just so anxious to get the incorporation going. He was the one that, because he was a lawyer too, so he was the one that was looking for as many to close up as many loopholes as possible. And so I think he realized, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation could challenge this, so let's get their permission. So that's one less thing that could bite us in the butt afterwards.
And it's something to be proud of too. And you think of our newspaper. I mean, the Mississauga News, from a newspaper is I'll do the math in my head, but 5 years older than the town/city itself. Of course, the town of Mississauga comes to be in 1968, but the towns of Port Credit and Streetsville are still independent. And then the three towns can't keep going as three towns, and they finally joined together in 1974 to become the city of Mississauga. And so, I always tell the story that Mississauga, as we know it, is not a village that became a town that became a city. It's a bunch of villages and towns that were once independent of each other that got lumped together to create the city.
It was a huge township. It was by far, like, township is what you have when you've got a few hundred people dispersed over a huge area, which is one reason why they went for incorporation as a city, because we can't function as a township anymore. 86,000 was the population when the average township in Canada at the time ranged between 200 to 500. And we were 86,500. So we were way behind in getting ourselves incorporated, which Mary Fix got the ball rolling on putting an end to township status, but she didn't want to apply for legal township status until we got some industries into town and started making ourselves financially self-reliant. And so we could have gone for township status as early as the 50s when Mary was around, but she was smart enough to say, no, let's get our treasury under control before we actually apply for town status. So I think she needs to be given her fair recognition, even though she was well out of politics by the time town status was granted.
Yeah, the road towards it started much earlier, and you have I'm reminded under Mary Fix was the essentially the promotional video called Cinderella Township.
Which is a great video. You got to see it.
So if you look up Cinderella Township on YouTube, you can find the
it's wonderfully corny. It's 1960s, and boy, it looks like a 1960s production.
But this is setting the stage for that growth period that would ultimately lead to amalgamation. And it just fascinating to look back at our time.
There's fighting there as well, because while Mary Fix clearly wanted growth, because she's the one who initiated it, she liked the idea of controlled growth, and so did Heil Chapel. They wanted to see the books balanced, but they didn't want to see Mississauga overrun. But then you had Bob Speck on the other side, who just wanted growth. And I can get it. He wants to, why not balance the books as fast as possible and get ourselves financially strong? But of course, you run the risk of being completely overrun. And I think in some ways, if we can be fair and maybe have some criticism of our city, it has been a little bit overrun by a lot of urban development all too quickly. And that was largely a result of not controlling that growth the way Mary and Heil would have preferred. But it happened, and we've got it.
Yeah, and our legacy of that is, we come back to it, is our residents chose the name, regardless of how they ended up there. And it was the winding route that the council took at the time, they still wound up at kind of basically where they started.
And not only did we choose it, we had to fight for it, because the public loved it clearly right from 1965, when the submission forms went out asking people to offer their suggestions. It was so far in front. We had to fight the politicians who didn't want it. Even when it finally came in and we were legally the town of Mississauga, then poor old Chick Murray found himself in a fight with Canada Post, because Canada Post says, well, we don't have any postal sorting stations called Mississauga. We get it that you've legally adopted that name in a democratic election, but the people that live there, if they're getting their mail sorted in Port Credit, even though they might live, say, in the Mineola or Lakeview, they might live in what is now the town of Mississauga, but their mail's still being sorted in Port Credit, or if they live up in the North End in Meadowvale and places like that where their mail's being sorted in Brampton. Post office is saying, well, they still have to write Brampton on their letters because that's where the postal sorting station is. And Chick Murray kind of got his feathers ruffled, even though we didn't really like the name Mississauga at first, as I mentioned. Now here he was fighting for it because it was the legally, the democratically elected name. But yeah, we had to fight the postal department. And really that was only resolved finally when postal codes came in the 70s. And if you think about it now, as far as the post office is concerned, you don't live in Mississauga. I don't live in Ottawa. You live in L4 something or other. I live in K2P. They reduce our neighborhoods down into number letter combinations. It's very efficient. But yeah, the Canada Post doesn't see cities anymore. It doesn't recognize them. It doesn't need to. So it was all for naught.
One of the fun things is we can, the what if game a little bit, and we can maybe end on this, but Mississauga has lots of different spellings. And
yes, that's where you come in. I'm glad you mentioned that. I would, because as I was doing my research, I realized at one point, I hope I quoted you in one article, because I had no idea how many different, and they're all legal because they're all on treaties.
Yep.
And I think you counted
14 or 15.
Yeah, it was, and they're all referring to the Mississauga Nation of Indians, is what they were called in most of them. But the spellings were all over the place. And so, yeah, even though we think of Mississauga, we take it for granted now. Even that was up in the air as to how we were going to spell the name.
And just for our listeners out there, ways in which those names appear in our landscape with other spellings is the next time you drive down Mississauga Road in the city of Mississauga, which are spelled the same, you will pass a Mississauga, or they pronounce it Mississauga, but it has an extra U at the end of the word.
Yes,
and they can call themselves what they want. They took the name first, and they chose to spell it a different way. And then if you go over the border down on Lakeshore Road into Oakville, one of the first roads you'll meet is Mississauga Street, which has no U in it, AGA at the end.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
So you've got them, they're all over the place in terms of the map. We took our spelling, presumably the decision was made in reference to how the Mississauga First Nation spelled their name at that time.
Which makes sense. That should have been whether we actually formally consulted the obvious source or not, I don't know. But yeah, that would have been the obvious solution. Why don't we actually go down to the credit reserve and actually ask the people that live there, how do you spell the name? And that's how we got Mississauga.
I always
I was going to say go into the.
I always kind of credited maybe Kenneth Armstrong with this. Maybe his newspaper didn't name the town, but maybe they chose the spelling of the name.
That's to be considered too, because that's how we spelled the newspaper name. So I never thought of that. So yeah, that would be most familiar to the people at the time.
Anyway.
But yeah, it's difficult to pronounce. There's still a famous tweet from Bonnie Crombie when, what was the situation? I guess Prime Minister Trudeau was down at the White House for some kind of an official state meeting.
Yep.
And the President, Obama at the time, talked about his stepsister, getting married to a gentleman from Burlington, but the wedding was in Toronto. And you can find it on YouTube. Just go Barack Obama, Mississauga, and type in. You will see him at the state dinner at the White House in front of all sorts of Canadians, including the Prime Minister, and he literally braces himself against the lectern, and 3 times, he wonderfully, because I'm a big fan of Obama, he diplomatically butchered the name of our city at least 3 times.
I remember that.
And Mayor Crombie was fast on Twitter to thank him for the shout-out. But yeah, I mean, if you realize even leaders for the free world are going to have a difficult time pronouncing our name, it makes you think maybe we should have thought about another name.
I think it's a treasured name for us. I'm I'm honored that we chose the name and its history there. I'm honored that we're connected to an Indigenous people that are still very much vibrant in our community and abroad across the province. And I think our name has so many rich layers to it, and it's something that defines us. I'm glad they didn't choose, personally, as a resident and a lifelong citizen here. I'm glad they didn't choose another one, although I guess the best council could agree on at the time was a 4-4 tie when it came to choosing.
Yeah, that's why I find it so interesting that, our city, that's how close it came to not even making it to the ballot.
Yeah.
And that's
Anyway.
But yeah, it is a great name. A lot of people didn't know. I remember some derisive comments coming from, he was the Metro chair at the time, Frank Gardner, said something ignorant about people will think you're a bunch of Eskimos and things like that. And so there were people that were making fun of the name at the time, but all the better that you can make fun of it all you want. We think it's a great name.
And like you said, we fought for it. And
how many people live in a city where they can say that not only do they know about how their town got its name, but they actually fought the politicians and chose that name of their own choice. I guess. Great story. What a great city.
Richard, thank you for sharing the story with us. And we look forward to future meanders down memory lane. And we wish you well and a very happy and healthy 2021. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks. And call on me anytime. I'm happy to talk.
Thank you for joining us again this week on Ask a Historian. And thank you also to Richard Collins for sharing his insights with us on how our city took its name. There are, of course, other things to explore in this story. We have really only touched the tip of the iceberg, as it were. Please keep sending in your questions or tell us things that you'd like to see explored. Be well, thank you, and all the very best to you in the year ahead.